sleepy.
Yeah.
This is the Social Factor.
Welcome back to the Social Factor.
Hello.
We're all here today.
Doing part 2 of Russia today.
Yeah, part 2 of what we know today as the former Soviet Union, and we're getting into the subject of the Cold War.
So, Facebook page, facebook.com/the Social Factor Podcast. That's our Facebook page. Anyway, we'll get right into the show. David, take it away. Cold War.
Well, you know, what can you say about Russia, right? I'm going to summarize what we talked about last week. Up until the Cold War started, before the Soviet Union existed, and before even the Tsars were, became what they are, you had, like in any other country, any other nation in the world, you had many, many tribes that either fought each other or joined each other. And that was pretty much the same with what would become Russia. And last week we covered pretty much the history until 1947, and that's where I'm going to begin. Now, the Cold War with the West begins in earnest as the Soviet Union consolidates power in Eastern Europe and promotes pro-Soviet revolution in China, the Middle East, and the Near East and Asia. So they really reached out to a majority of the world with their ideology, the ideologies of the communism and equality and so on and so forth. And and unfortunately the truth behind that is that while Bolshevism and Marxism had some reasons for being created, it ended up becoming pretty much an upper class dictatorship in that regime. So very, very small percentage of the Soviet Union was run by pretty much the military. Okay, so in 1949, Soviets explode their first nuclear bomb. Cold War rivals begin nuclear arms race, and so 1949 was the big indicator that we may have a nuclear war on this planet before it all ends. The United States immediately went into ballistic missiles, with warheads that were nuclear. Before that, you had in 1945 the United States dropped 2 bombs over Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that was kind of the land that anyone really was building it. And then all of a sudden, here in 1949, the Russians have their first test. That scared the living daylights out of the Western world, and the Russians were very proud of it and celebrated as a nation. In the 1950s, the Soviet competition for power was the West, extended to Latin America and former European colonies in Africa, making Cold War a global issue. When we talk about Latin America, if you're talking about Venezuela, that was strongly influenced by that. You had parts of Argentina, Nicaragua, Honduras. Those nations, Honduras was very much dominated by the ideology, and Nicaragua, they were kind of a mix. It was more of a federation, I guess, and they were being supported by the United States, and there was conflict between those two nations because of the ideologies and the fact they wanted to expand their territory. And unfortunately, South America has had problems like that for even before the Soviets got involved. All right, so let's see. 1953, death of Stalin. I thought he died in 57, but that's okay. So 1953, Stalin died, which ushered in less repressive rule at home. And although Communist Party politically dominated Russia. So it had a firm grip on not only Russia but all the satellite countries it controlled. Of course, they called it, what was the word they used last time? Client countries? Client states?
I have no idea.
Oh, you listen like a box of rocks.
I could have told you that one.
Yeah, the client states is what the Russians used to describe satellite countries, which was the word the Allies or the Western countries would use, because they were an extension of the Soviet Union, okay, or within the realm of the Soviet Union. All right, so a client state or a satellite state is the same thing, okay. And somehow I ended up back in the 1930s. Okay, let's go. All right, so Stalin, thank God, passes away in 1953. And I think what is really important to explain, and kind of inter overlaps with the Korean history that we had, is that Stalin, while he really established the North Korean state, and he had a big part in the in mobilizing Korea and making them who they are today. When the Korean War came around, Stalin wanted nothing to do with it, and so China took because what happened is Mao Zedong, which was he was the head of the revolution in China, and he became the first, I guess, dictator of China. Him and Stalin were at odds, okay, and during the original invasion of the 38th parallel, okay, crossing that line, that red line that wasn't supposed to be crossed, China wanted Russia to give them the air support, meaning the Red Air Force. And right at the last minute, Stalin says, I don't want the wrath of the West coming at me because I'm closer to it than you are, And back then, you couldn't just put everybody in a plane and drop them off. It was a lot more logistically challenging. So in the end, Stalin stepped away from that because he was already dealing with his own issues in that area. So, in 1950 through 51 is when the Chinese took over. And that was the first time that the Chinese took a strong stance in that region, So, besides the Japanese wanting to do that. So, okay, so, in 1957, Soviet artificial satellite Sputnik, now have you ever heard that name?
Yes,
yeah, Sputnik, okay. It's a satellite, becomes first to orbit the Earth, spurring the Cold War beyond the atmosphere in a space race. So we go from a nuclear race to a space race. Now Kennedy answered that call. Okay, our former President Kennedy, may he rest in peace, and how he died was horrible. He looked at that, and of course all of America was wounded at this point, And so were the Brits. They were really nervous. Okay, now they can go up to space. Holy shit, And so yeah, it really like all of a sudden there was this competitive nature about the Americans and the Russians, and the Russians were doing this. What are you gonna do to us? Yeah, you can't touch us. And it was an ideology war, because Russia says, they're saying, look at what we've already accomplished, and the Americans are going, but we are freedom. We give people the individual rights to be who they are, which wasn't true either. And capitalism this, and communists are, and socialism this, and
you did it. Now we need to do better.
Well, and that's what happened. So the amount of money that went into initially starting the space race, and it carried over for the next several decades, was just crazy. I mean, but the Americans could actually sustain it. The Russians couldn't, and that'll come in later when you go more between the 70s all the way to the 90s. All right, so let's go back. Okay, so now as we said, in 1957, Sputnik goes up. Boom. Okay. 1961, a very important year in the world history, not only American and Russian. A officer, he was an officer, an Air Force officer, by the name of Yuri Gagarin. Okay. He becomes the first person to orbit the Earth.
Wow.
It was a Russian. The Russians even beat the United States by that. And
I bet that made them mad. The US mad.
And it was called the Vostok spacecraft. So the Americans are getting beat left and right on, because it's a race now.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, wow. And they're thinking, okay, if they have this capability, what the hell are they going to do to us nuclear-wise?
Mm-hmm.
The United States was very frightened at this point. So they beefed up every part of security, like nuclear security. They like really expanded the nuclear program to enrich the uranium and all these other processes. And the Russians, I mean, the thing is the United States was dependent on a budget that the U.S. government or the U.S. Congress allowed them to have. The Russians, they didn't care. They didn't care how many people suffered. They're doing this. You know, there was no concern about that. So it was a little bit of a different stand. They didn't have a Congress that would stop them from doing it. Yeah. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So in the United States, there was a lot of hurdles to overcome. But once the government had the funding, you know, and I mean, let me tell you something. Let's talk about the influence on the American space race and the nuclear space race. Do you know what the influence was? Former Nazis.
Oh, wow.
Because, there was after the war, the Americans could see what was going to happen, and the Russians also could see what was going to happen. And believe it or not, Russia had more portions of the important parts of Germany than the West did. All the generals, all the soldiers, the elites, and the scientists were in that portion, on the east side.
Okay.
And they were forced to work, where in the United States, they were recruited. And a lot of the head of the Nazis, the ones that were really bad, were brought into this country or brought over to South America, and later on brought back to be utilized for tactical reasons, for engineering. You ever heard of von Braun? Von Braun. He was one of the head of the U.S. missile systems. He used to make the V-2 rocket for the Hitler regime. Okay, V-2 rocket, V-1 and V-2 were the first rockets that were unmanned, and they had a gyroscope that the Germans invented. So once they launched it, it was within a mile of its target that it could actually hit, and sometimes it went over and hit innocent locations like the populous areas. But it was meant to strike fear into, especially England. Unfortunately, the V-1 and V-2 rockets really were geared towards the British people. Okay, so the engineer of that ended up working for the United States.
Okay.
And he was in the most classified part of whatever you can, you know. Mm-hmm. So remember I told you this before, that the Germans benefited through the Americans, while the Germans did not benefit through the Russians. Okay, and they were put into really bad situations, rightfully so. Okay, but so let's go back to this. So Yuri Gagarin pretty much embarrasses the United States, and the CIA, by this point it's the CIA. They kind of knew about it, but they didn't know when it was going to happen, you know. Okay. So the United States is scrambling, okay? And then they came up, of course, with NASA. There was a predecessor to NASA, but pretty much the one even before it was already working on, you know, getting the equipment done, getting the capsules made, and then getting the top of the top to become astronauts, okay? And the Russians were 2 steps ahead of the United States at this time. All right. So, 1962, now anyone that lived around that time can remember this. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I've read a bunch about it.
And it brings the world to a brink of nuclear war. Perceived defeat for Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev hastened his ouster 2 years later by more conservative factions, eventually led by, I remember him, Leonid Brezhnev. Now, he became, I forget what their title is, but they're like the head of the party, okay? Because you have the Communist Party, like the Nazi Party, you know, and you know, he became the head. It's not like chancellor or anything, or prime minister or anything. In modern day, they are prime minister and then the president. They have 2 different positions available within the Russian government. But back then, I forget what the name for Stalin and everybody else that followed him was. Yeah. Because before that it was the Tsar, you know, and they're definitely not Tsars.
Right, that was...
So yeah, Brezhnev took over. He was kind of a conservative, like a true communist, okay? And I remember watching like little reels of him when he was speaking to the UN, or if he was making a speech to his own people, and he looked like he had jowls, okay? And he had like the thickest eyebrows. I'll never forget it. Brezhnev had the thickest eyebrows, and very common in Russia. But not you figure someone that is publicly known should have better eyebrows. Yeah.
Maybe he didn't care. I know
Oh
a lot of
no,
people
he
that
didn't.
don't care.
Definitely not. So Nikita Khrushchev, because of the failure of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Russians, Kennedy put him in his spot and said, "Listen, we're not going to back down. Take those missiles away from Cuba." Okay, and because at this point, you ever heard of Castro? Yeah,
Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro. Now, I believe it was 56, 57. Castro and his guys overthrew the government that was in place at the time, and it was affiliated to the United States. But the funny thing is that Castro had CIA support. Most people don't know that, but he was funded by the United States, and then he turned on us because the Russians were willing to support him even more.
Oh.
And if you speak to most Americans who were in the federal government most of them are dead, but you will see that the reason remember the embargo we had since the 60s, all the way into maybe we still have an embargo on them. Part of that was we were pissed off that he allied himself with Russia. Okay. And so then you have 1962. The incident was the Russian Navy delivering 2 warheads to Cuba, and it was. I understand the United States' reaction to it. Okay, it was way too close for comfort. All right, Cuba's not that far off of our coast.
Right.
I think it's 72 miles, maybe more, maybe 100 miles at the most.
It's too close.
Yeah, and so Kennedy. It was. I mean, my dad even remembers this. He's like, we thought we were going to die, all of us. And back then you had these drills going on,
I remember
duck, hide.
I remember some of those old ones.
Yeah, just like that's going to save your ass. Come
hide
on.
under the desk and cover your head or
But
whatever.
but the public wasn't told of the severity of a true nuclear attack. Now, Japanese were more aware of that. Because their people really suffered under that. I mean, within what was it? They said within each blast, the radius, there's like levels. The first is complete incineration, and then the second one is like just the heat alone will do them, and then the third is like a mile after mile after mile. And I think you have to be 75 miles outside not to truly be injured, but the radiation will still get you. Now you think about that radius, okay?
It's huge impact.
So the U.S. had to do something, and Kennedy, it was like a poker game. Everybody described it as Kennedy staring down Khrushchev, and Khrushchev, he fought in World War II, and he was a well-known general. This guy didn't take any shit from nobody. And Khrushchev he had to back down, and that's one of the reasons he was taken out of office within 2 years from that time.
Because
so by 60, well, there was a no-win situation for Khrushchev. Had he not done it, it would have been World War III. But it also tells you that the Russians aren't evil people. They recognized, okay, we can't destroy the world. You know, otherwise they would have done it years ago. So, all right, let's forward. Now this title is called the Stagnation Period. Okay, so apparently everything kind of mellowed out. Okay, so between 1965 through 1970, Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin tries to introduce profit and bonus elements and some decentralization of planning in order to boost flagging economy, output, and competitiveness, but is thwarted by disappointing results and opposition by party conservatives. So this guy right here, the Prime Minister, and I guess you could probably call like Khrushchev Prime Minister as well, because I know he didn't last that long. He was like 4 or 5 years in there. Unless he was still, Prime Minister is a different rank. So he would, Leonid Brezhnev was a president. Is an equivalent to a president. I remember reading this. Okay, so this Prime Minister brings in these capitalistic ideas, because by 1965 to 1970, they started seeing the economic problems that Russia was running into, or the Soviet Union. And considering if you ever look at the nature of Russia, and then when it was Soviet Union, Russia is the biggest country in the world. Now you added all these satellite countries, and you have to have military personnel and all these logistic things. And I mean, the United States can fit almost twice into that region. Okay, And they have like the largest amount of people on the planet other than China and India. So it's the third highest population on the planet. And so this guy was trying to basically kind of reform some of the economic policies. And the right wings or the communist conservatives are like, no, you don't change the way we have been doing it for the last how many years.
They were just starting to see the problems with flawed communism. I
Yeah.
mean, communism can't be perfect, and if it's not, it can't work, in my opinion.
And the problem is that communism went from being a commune, where everybody's equal, to you need leadership. And it in a way, communism replaced the same order as the Tsar already had in place, like a monarchy.
Okay.
And it just trickled down, and China was worse than Russia. I mean, they were really bad, okay? But when just look at North Korea and you see a degree into Russia, and once we cover China, you'll see some other issues, because in many ways I find China to be more dangerous than Russia, quite honestly, based on what I've studied in the past. So this prime minister tried to make some changes. He wanted to help sustain the Soviet Union, and within 20 years it was almost gone. So this guy was right. Had he taken on some of the principles of the United States, they would have probably survived. We still have the Soviet Union, quite honestly, but they didn't listen. So we go to just the 1970s now. Consolidation of Leonid Brezhnev's rule sees economic stagnation and widespread corruption, undermining public faith in any superiority of the Soviet model. Just as we discussed, Soviet model is communism, and so now you're starting to see tension arise, and there's like, I don't want to say there were factions, but there were, and the Soviet Union suppressed anyone that opposed the Communist Party in a manner that was pretty brutal sometimes. Okay, and I remember as a child I would hear about this. Okay, efforts to rein in Cold War tension through U.S.-Soviet detent collapsed in aftermath of Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in 1979. Now I remember that very well. Afghanistan was started. I don't know if any of you have seen Red Dawn.
No.
I have, yes.
Okay. That movie was based on the Afghan invasion of Soviet Union.
I've seen the new series, the new one, not the old one.
Yeah, the old one is from my generation, but the new one's really good. Okay, and what it talks about is these commercial airliners flying over the United States, and then they drop paratroopers. Okay, it's exactly how the Russians went into Afghanistan. Commercial airliners, not military airliners. And it was paratroopers that went into at first to secure locations that were vital to overtake the Afghan government, which was very weak. Okay, and so here they are. So it's 1979 is when it started, and it was looked upon very, very critically of how the Russians invaded, because it was almost covert. Okay. Yeah. And it was, using commercial airliners was kind of a taboo thing. Right? However, that's how they chose to do it. And I know a lot of people don't realize why they entered Afghanistan, and I did do some reading on it. And there was some issues because Afghanistan was kind of certain parts of it was part of the Soviet Union. Okay. And there was some ethnic issues going on, and some persecution on the Muslim side. Okay. But that wasn't the only reason. It was also a territory, I believe it was rich in oil.
I believe it still is.
Yeah. Although Iraq is higher than... In Afghanistan, the terrain makes it more difficult to retrieve it or extract it. But I would love to say I know the whole reason behind it. All I knew is it started this Vietnam for Russia.
Oh.
Okay.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it became very unpopular even in Russia. Or for the Soviet Union, and from 79 to 1988, that's the duration of it. Yeah, but had it not been for the U.S., the Russians would have been able to sustain the war. We started supplying the Afghans with what's called the Stinger missiles, and we also had even though that's been denied, we had U.S. operatives over there training these Afghanis.
I believe it.
And Osama bin Laden was one of them.
Okay.
Okay? You know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, so let's continue. Between 1985, which is the year I left Germany to come to this gorgeous country, to 1991, rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev. Does that sound familiar?
Yes,
Okay.
I've heard of him.
Never heard of him.
Oh, you suck.
I know quite a bit
He's
more
the one-
history
him
than
and
Josh
Reagan-
does.
Him and Reagan became best friends.
Okay.
And he was what you call a moderate communist.
I take it this guy was president of Russia at one
He was.
point. Okay.
He was president. He was the head of the KGB. He was the head of the Soviet Party or the Communist Party.
KGB?
KGB, yeah, it's the secret.
Yeah.
Like the
Of
KGB
Russia?
is equivalent
Uh-huh.
to the CIA.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like the CIA, they were very well trained. In fact, Putin, the current president, the current president of Russia, was a major in the KGB.
Wow.
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't.
Oh yeah, he's a badass.
Does K stand for Kremlin?
Say what?
K stand for Kremlin?
Baby,
No.
it's probably in
No,
Russian.
KGB are the initials of what the like we have the Central Intelligence Agency,
Yeah.
the CIA, and KGB are
Also, it's
the
probably
Russian initials.
So
Or
it's kinda
invert.
like in Russian.
Yeah, that's what I
oh
just
yeah,
said.
what are they
It
gonna
is-
do it in Latin?
No, they're gonna do it in English.
Oh yeah. So just so we know what they're talking about.
Okay, so apparently with this episode, I'm the dumbest one here.
No, it's just you're not aware of the
Yeah,
information.
yeah.
It's
Now-
just unfortunately, dear, we both know more history than you do.
Yeah.
Now the KGB was substituted once Russia fell, and it became the FSB. Okay. And that is the current Russian, like they're the Central Intelligence Agency of Russia.
Okay.
They took the spot of the
Yeah.
KGB.
By the way, I asked if it stood for Kremlin because like I know, like for instance, like you know how like for us the government is like the White House. Well, for England or the United Kingdom, it's Parliament.
Mhm.
For Russia,
Well,
it's
there you
the
have
Kremlin.
two. You have two things. You have the Parliament, but you also have the monarchy behind it.
Yeah, you also have Buckingham Palace.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, it's
But
definitely
no,
the British
that's
monarchy.
different.
It's the location. Buckingham Palace is. Oh, I'm sorry. Is only a location.
Okay.
It's a palace. It's one of the palaces for the Queen.
Well, the other
Why
one
don't you
is
do me a favor? While I continue talking, look up the word KGB on the
Yeah.
computer, and let's get an accurate pronunciation of what it means in the version.
okay.
Because I'll tell you, you won't be able to read the Russian version.
And I won't be able to pronounce it, even
Yeah.
if I could pretend to
I
read
might
it.
be able to.
The KGB in initialism for Komitet
Okay, I thought
Gosu-
we decided we weren't going to read the Russian.
No, it's
Oh,
phonetic.
that's...
Sudar
Is that English?
Stvenoi Bezopasnosti,
I don't think
translated
Okay.
in English as Committee for State Security,
I was going to say, I'm
was the main-
pretty sure you're reading the Russian.
was the main security agency for the Soviet Union from 1954 until its breakup in 1991.
Voila, that's exactly what I said. Now look at who's currently the national security. Look at the word.
Yes.
current
no,
Russian-
Yeah.
Say current Russian substitute for KGB.
Are you talking about Federal Security Service, the superseding agencies?
Yeah, is it down there?
Yeah, it's a
FSB or FSC?
FSS.
FSS, yeah. Yeah, that's the Russian one.
Federal Security. Hold on a second. FSB.
FSB, right? See,
Yeah.
I was right.
What? No, it says FSS, but up here it says it's short for SFB.
Yeah.
Russian.
Okay, the Federal Security
I
Service.
told you I know my stuff.
Yeah.
The Federal Security Service of the
I
Russian
don't doubt you.
Federation is the principal security agency of Russia and the main successor agency to the USSR's Committee of State Security.
All right. Okay. So we're moving. Okay. Thank you for looking that up. Really appreciate it.
It's located in Moscow, Russia, and it was founded by Boris Yeltsin
Correct. In
in
1990.
1995.
In 95, I thought it was 19... Oh, right. 91 was when they filmed. But yeah, we're going to get to Boris... In fact, we're not very far from the Boris Yeltsin era. Okay? So, Oh, here, this is cool. So, rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev heralds serious efforts to reform, this word is kind of odd, moribund economy, perestroika, which is, it's like it was a newspaper, you know? Oh, I'm sorry, Glasnost was a newspaper, so perestroika was more like an ideology, and then free up political debate on Glasnost, which was a national paper. And it started, at first they weren't allowed to do anything, and then he came into power, and the next thing you know, there was dialogue, okay? Which was awesome. And ended crippling cost of continuing Cold War, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, right. So Gorbachev gradually loses control of reform process at home and abroad, leading to collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe, and eventually implosion of the Soviet Union itself. Boom! It doesn't exist anymore. Alright, so instead, we get the Yeltsin era. Starting in 1991, Russia becomes independent as the Soviet Union collapses, and together with Ukraine and Belarus, which I love that area, forms the Commonwealth of Independent States, which eventually joined by most former Soviet republics, except the Baltic states. And quite a few of those are the former Yugoslavia, okay, Moravia, and all those other EAS, okay, and of course they would end up fighting amongst each other, you know. But it was more about ethnicity than anything else, and religion, okay. So Chechnya declares unilateral independence, beginning a decade of conflict with Moscow. Now Chechnya is a Muslim state, okay, and they were in affiliation with Al Qaeda and all these other organizations. Now in '91, no, but you know, after '94 on, as they were fighting the Russians, they started getting support from several Islamic organizations, which drew the Americans into it because they were interested in what's going on. You know,
Yeah.
this was way before 9/11, so. Okay, so 1992, Russia takes up the seat of the former Soviet Union on the United Nations Security Council and retains control of its nuclear arsenal. And at first, there was a lot of danger regarding the nuclear arsenal because they were abandoned.
Yeah.
Russia no longer had soldiers protecting them. So there were like neighboring, especially in the Ukraine, because Ukraine had a major warehouse of nuclear arms. And so there was actually a lot of missing nuclear warheads, and some of them ended up in the Middle East, you know, and like
That's
Iran being number one in there, and so there was a lot of security issues going on throughout the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Romania was one of them. You had Bulgaria was also an area where they had some military hardware. And a lot of these independent former KGB agents were selling them because, you know what, they needed money.
Yeah.
The ruble was kaput. You know, I think the ruble's back now under a new, look. But once the wall fell and once the Soviet Union destabilized, the ruble went down from. I remember watching it too. It's like, you know, I was an adult by this point. Okay. And I'm looking, and you know, you look at the values of every currency, and at one point ruble's here, and then it started dropping, and then really dropped right as it all ended, and then at that point it became devaluated, okay, and so for like a good 5 to 10 years, it was the mighty dollar that was making the difference, because the ruble was kaput, you know, and that's the main Russian currency. All right, so. Alright, so acting prime Yegor Gaidar launched controversial program of lifting central controls on economy to prevent total collapse. Opponents claimed it is poorly managed and directly responsible for hyperinflation. Remember we talked about that? And the rise of the oligarchs. Okay. Businessmen who benefit from crush privatization of massive state enterprise. You get what I'm saying? So right now you got all kinds of people out of control, and some of them were former KGB agents who had connections and affiliations worldwide.
Doing what they can do to get by.
Yeah, and again, weapons trades or selling of weapons that's including tanks, RPGs, anything that the military had to offer. And sometimes it was colonels to generals and up, because they were they had the access to this, and some of the states were completely independent and unmanaged, especially the military bases. So this was a bad time for Russia. And also for the world, because shit was disappearing. Yeah, nobody had an account on stuff. All right, so
something disappears, pops up in another country the next day.
Yeah, next thing you know, you have well, that's just it. Movies make that very plausible, like like James Bond movie, or like especially the new versions of it. It's pretty cool.
I like James.
They talk about sudden threats,
Oh, we love spy movies and stuff like that.
Oh yeah. All right, so let's go to 93. 1993, September through October, President Boris Yeltsin sends in troops to seize parliament from opponents of his rule. So, all of a sudden, he decides he's under threat, and he sends the military into parliament and basically pretty much arrests them or under house arrest, whatever it was, because they became a threat to his power.
Yeah.
So. Communist and nationalist opposition makes large gains in elections to new Duma parliament. So you have a lot of pro-communist and nationalists. And nationalists are a little different from communists because nationalists are for Russia, communists are for the Soviet Union. So you have like these two factions now.
Yeah. It becomes two different things.
And potentially a threat to each other. So 1994. Russia joins NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Now, let's talk about NATO, because this is really... Why was NATO actually created, and what does it stand for?
North American...
No.
New Agreement...
I don't know what it stands for.
North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Okay,
the NATO. Okay? And, it was a good guess,
You're doing your best.
And why was NATO created? To have all these countries there in case Russia decides to invade. So they were actually created for the Soviet Union.
They were created as an alliance to say, hey, in case Russia invades, we're all sticking together.
Yeah, that's why NATO.
Was that scared of World War III.
Let me tell you something. Even the German military was in NATO.
Okay.
My cousin's husband spent 2.5 years in the Luftwaffe, in the Air Force, okay? His only duty station was in the NATO.
So, North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yeah. And the thing about that, some of the best training is done with NATO. The greatest operation. U.S., I think they have over 32 or 38 different countries involved, to include Turkey, Greece, most of Central to Western Europe, former Soviet nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and those. Hungary is being one of them. They're now in. Poland, friggin', they're awesome. I love the Poles. They were the first one on board when
Good
Wall
for
fell.
them.
They were the first one on board. They petitioned the U.S. and the United Nations and all this, and they got a hold of NATO and says, put us anywhere we need to be. And so the Poles are cool,
That is pretty cool.
And the Swedes are in there, the Danes, Dutch, British are part of NATO. Even some Central Asian countries are there. You have, why don't you look up NATO membership before and then after the fall of Russia. And while you're doing that, I'm going to continue. Russian troops. Okay, so the same year in 1994, Russian troops launched 2-year recapture the breakaway Republic of Chechnya, which ends with...
Wait, so even Russia is a member of NATO?
In recent years, yes.
Oh, I was saying...
In 94, they petitioned for it.
I was going to say, an organization that was created originally to protect the world from Russia.
Correct.
Russia, basically...
Not Russia, the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Russia's the same thing, but you got to look at the difference in what Russia is today compared to what it used to be.
So then
After the
Russia
fall
joined
of-
it to say basically,
before the fall of Russia.
hey, this isn't going to happen again, but if it does, we're all in with you.
Well, here's the thing: Russia's no longer the threat,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
NATO still has all the tools and the logistics to be everywhere if it needs to be. You know, I mean, they can be in
Because so many
Angola,
people are
Africa.
there, yeah.
They can be in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia, if there's be there. You know, and NATO still has a purpose. It's just a different mission now. It's no longer the Soviet Union. Okay.
It says formal contacts and cooperation between Russia and NATO began in 1991 within the framework of the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, later renamed Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council,
Trying to find the numbers.
and were further deepened as Russia joined the Partnership for Peace program on
That's
June 27,
1994.
1994.
Yeah, and that's what I was doing. And that was their way into starting communication with NATO. And mind you, that's like 3 years after the fall, you know?
Oh, and it says right here, NATO has added new members 7 times since its founding in 1949. And since 2017, NATO has had 29 members. 12 countries were part of the founding of NATO. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
I thought there was more members. I'm surprised. I know Poland has applied for it right after the wall fell.
Okay.
But I could swear they got in. Because I remember reading an
Are
article
they
on
not
it.
in?
It doesn't sound like it.
What?
I can't read the...
They're not part of the
I can't
membership
read the
of NATO?
article. Let me at the article.
Are we gonna need a part 3 of this?
No, I'm
I
going to make
just
it real
want to
quick.
look
I got
at the
I need some air.
article.
Oh, I was just wondering, because we're at about 3 minutes.
Alright, part 3, Jim.
Oh, I didn't see that part.
That's what I was trying to get you to click on. Yeah, Poland's part of it. They joined in 1999, though.
Yeah, okay. Alright, let's do
I
this.
love your face.
Let's
I
continue.
love your face, too.
Alright, children. We got a show on. Alright, I'm going to do it real quick. Q. 1995, Communist Party emerges as largest party in parliamentary elections with more than a third of the seat. So, in a way, the Communist Party still has power. 1996, Yeltsin re-elected despite concerns about his health. And if he wouldn't have drank so much, he would have been fine. Russia admitted to the G7 group of industrialized countries suspended in March of 2014. Alright. Now there's a lot more. We can get into the Putin era, which began in 2000.
Yeah,
Actually, 1999.
We'll need to do this all next time,
I think we're
guess.
gonna need a part.
Yeah,
3.
we're gonna have a part 3, damn it.
This will be the first.
But,
this
while
will be
we're here on the Wikipedia page and we still have time left, do you want to read off the actual members of
okay.
NATO, my dear?
Yes. Should I read when they started?
No, just give me the country.
Okay. So, in 1949, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdom, and United States. Then in 1952, Greece and Turkey joined. In 1955, Germany joined. 1982, Spain joined. 1999 was the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And then March 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia,
That's the Baltic.
Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia in 2004. In 2009 was Albania and Croatia. And most recently, in 2017, Montenegro.
Montenegro, yeah. Alright, so we have it. I was pretty
That was the
I was pretty
actual
accurate about
numbers
some of those.
NATO.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we couldn't get through this fast enough because sometimes we have to discuss what we're reading, and
I would rather do it in 3 parts and
Sure.
discuss than straight
And
read the facts, to be
It
honest.
appears that on this list, it appears that United States has the most active personnel
always has.
in NATO.
Yeah,
in
because
NATO.
they have a military personnel chart on there as well.
Yeah, the U.S. has been the prime example of why NATO existed in the first place.
They also have the most for people on reserve for NATO.
Yeah. Yeah, they always do.
Yeah. So we have a total of 3,673,000 active personnel for all countries.
Mm-hmm.
3.7 million for whatever. All right.
Yeah, you have a couple seconds. We gotta say bye, guys.
All right. We have to say goodbye.
We'll
And
see you next week with the same topic.
We will.
Part
yeah.
3!
Part 3 of Russia, the very first Part 3 episode in for the social factor.
And it's driving me crazy.
All right.
I think we're fine. See you next
A lot of history with Russia. Bye.
Bye-bye.